The room was louder than it had any right to be, not because people were shouting, but because expectation itself had weight, and that weight pressed against the walls like unseen thunder. Cameras lined the back of the hall, their red recording lights blinking patiently, waiting for something, anything that could be turned into a headline, a clip, a moment to be replayed and dissected by millions. This was supposed to be a routine charity forum, a carefully managed public event with polite applause and predictable speeches, yet something in the air felt wrong, unsettled, as if everyone sensed they were standing at the edge of a moment that would refuse to stay small. Keanu Reeves sat near the front, shoulders relaxed, hands folded loosely, his expression calm in a way that looked almost out of place among the restless energy around him. While beside him, Alexandra Grant watched the room with quiet awareness, her eyes reading people the way others read scripts, already noticing who underestimated, who whispered, and who assumed they knew exactly who Keanu was before he ever spoke. No one expected trouble to begin so subtly, with a smile that lingered too long, and a comment delivered just softly enough to sound harmless. The moderator, a well-dressed man whose confidence came from familiarity with power rather than respect for it, glanced toward Keanu and offered a laugh that drew scattered chuckles from the audience. He spoke about humble celebrities, about people who play the quiet role while benefiting from a system they never truly challenge. And though he never said Keanu's name outright, his eyes flicked in that direction just long enough for the implication to land. A few people nodded, some smiled knowingly, and others leaned forward, sensing drama. Alexandra's posture changed slightly, not with anger, but with recognition. She had seen this pattern before, the way kindness was mistaken for weakness, silence for absence, humility for emptiness. Keanu, however, remained still, his face unreadable, as if he were listening not only to the words, but to the intent beneath them. The moderator continued, growing bolder with every unchallenged sentence, framing his remarks as honest discussion, suggesting that real impact came from loud declarations and visible dominance, not from quiet consistency or private acts of compassion. The room shifted, the way rooms do when people sense permission to judge. Whispers spread, cameras adjusted angles, and a few attendees exchanged glances that carried the familiar edge of superiority. This was the moment many had waited for without knowing it, the chance to watch a man known for restraint be subtly diminished in public, to see whether he would defend himself or retreat further into silence. Alexandra turned to Keanu then, not urging him to speak, not pressing him to respond, but offering something far rarer: trust. Her expression said she believed in his timing, in his way, in the depth that never rushed to the surface for applause. Keanu finally lifted his head, and though the movement was small, it rippled through the room like a sudden change in temperature. He didn't interrupt, he didn't raise his hand. He simply waited until the moderator paused to breathe, then leaned slightly forward and asked, quietly and without edge, if he might say something. The request itself caught people off guard. There was no challenge in his tone, no performance in his posture, just a gentle certainty that made refusal feel inappropriate. The moderator, still smiling, gestured for him to continue, clearly expecting a mild, forgettable response, something safe, something brief, something that would allow the narrative to remain intact. Keanu spoke softly, so softly that the room had to lean in to hear him, and in doing so, everyone became complicit in listening. He didn't start with defense or correction. He started with gratitude for the opportunity, for the people present, for the reminder that conversations about impact mattered. His voice carried no accusation, yet each word landed with precision, like a calm hand placed on a shaking surface. He spoke about power not as something claimed, but as something carried, about influence not as noise, but as responsibility. He talked about the unseen moments that never make headlines, the private apologies, the silent support, the choice to listen instead of dominate. And as he spoke, the earlier laughter in the room began to feel misplaced, even uncomfortable. The tension shifted when Keanu addressed the idea that quiet people did nothing. He shared, without naming names or places, stories of individuals he had met through his life, crew members, strangers, people whose lives were shaped not by grand speeches, but small, consistent acts of respect. He spoke about how real change often happened away from cameras, precisely because it wasn't meant to be transactional. The room grew still, the kind of stillness that isn't enforced, but earned. Alexandra watched faces change, watched shoulders drop, watched certainty dissolve into reflection, and she understood that something irreversible was happening, not a confrontation, but an awakening. What unsettled people most was not what Keanu said, but how little he seemed to need their approval. He wasn't trying to win the room, he was inviting it to reconsider itself. When he paused, the silence stretched, no one daring to interrupt, and in that pause lived the unspoken realization that the assumptions made just minutes earlier were collapsing under their own weight. The moderator's smile tightened, not with anger, but with discomfort, as he sensed control slipping away without a single raised voice. Keanu concluded not with a declaration, but with a question, one that asked whether kindness needed volume to matter, and whether humility was truly weakness or simply strength that didn't ask to be witnessed. Applause came slowly at first, hesitant, uneven, then grew into something genuine, something unforced. It wasn't thunderous, but it was sincere, and it carried a different kind of power. Keanu nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and leaned back, as if returning the room to itself. Alexandra felt a quiet swell of emotion, not of pride and spectacle, but respect for restraint, for the courage it took to remain gentle in a world that constantly rewarded aggression. Around them, people avoided eye contact, then sought it, processing what they had just experienced. No one had been attacked, yet many felt exposed, confronted by their own assumptions. As the event moved on, something had changed beneath the surface. Conversations sounded different, laughter softened, people listened more carefully. The cameras kept recording, but the real shift wasn't in what they captured, it was in what they couldn't. Keanu spoke softly, yes, but the impact lingered, echoing far beyond the room, settling into the kind of awareness that doesn't fade when the lights turn off. And though no one yet realized it fully, this moment was only the beginning. The quietest voice in the room had just set something in motion, and the world would soon feel the consequences of underestimating a man who never needed to be loud to be heard.
What people rarely understood was that moments like the one Keanu Reeves had just created did not end when the applause stopped. They only changed shape, slipping quietly into conversations, into headlines written with half-truths, into opinions formed without context and shared without restraint. By the time Keanu and Alexandra stepped out of the venue, the evening air felt heavier than when they had arrived, as though the city itself had absorbed the tension and was holding on to it. Phones buzzed relentlessly in pockets and handbags. Journalists already reframing the moment, some praising the calm dignity of his words, while others twisted the narrative into something sharper, more divisive, as if restraint itself were suspicious. Alexandra noticed how quickly the world tried to decide what the moment had meant, how uncomfortable people became when they couldn't neatly label courage as aggression or kindness as weakness. By the following morning, clips from the event were everywhere, but none captured the full truth. Short excerpts removed the stillness, stripped away the context, and repackaged Keanu's soft-spoken reflection as either a subtle rebuke or a carefully calculated image move. Comment sections filled with polarized reactions, some accusing him of virtue signaling, others defending him passionately, and many revealing more about their own frustrations than about the man they claimed to analyze. Keanu read none of it. He had learned long ago that public noise rarely led to understanding, and that chasing explanations only fed the very hunger for spectacle he had refused to serve. Alexandra, however, paid attention, not to the insults, but to the patterns, to the way empathy itself seemed to provoke discomfort in people who had built their identities on dominance. The pressure did not come from strangers alone. Invitations were quietly withdrawn. A few industry figures who once praised Keanu's humility now questioned whether his approach was too passive for the moment, suggesting, with polite concern, that silence could be misinterpreted as avoidance and gentleness as moral ambiguity. These conversations were never confrontational, always wrapped in professional language and friendly smiles, yet Alexandra recognized the underlying message immediately. Speak louder, choose sides more aggressively, become easier to market. Keanu listened when these concerns were brought to him, not dismissively, not defensively, but with the same careful attention he gave to everything, and then he declined to change anything at all. His refusal wasn't dramatic, it was simply firm, rooted in a belief that integrity lost its meaning the moment it became negotiable. The real strain surfaced in private, during quiet evenings when the world felt closer and the distance between intention and consequence narrowed. Alexandra sensed the weight Keanu carried, not as regret, but as responsibility. He understood that his words, however gentle, had stirred something unresolved in people, and that once stirred, such things demanded either growth or backlash. She reminded him, not with reassurance, but with honesty, that discomfort was often the first step toward awareness, and that not every reaction required response. Their conversations were unhurried, thoughtful, grounded in mutual respect, and marked by a shared understanding that doing the right thing did not guarantee being understood, especially not immediately. As days passed, stories began to surface. Quiet ones, shared privately at first, from people who had been in the room that night or who had seen the unedited footage before it vanished behind commentary. A stagehand spoke about how Keanu had remembered his name years after a single encounter. A volunteer shared how a brief conversation with him during a difficult moment had altered her sense of self-worth. These accounts did not trend, they weren't sensational enough, not loud enough for the algorithm, yet they spread steadily, carried by people who recognized themselves in the humility he embodied. Alexandra watched this quiet countercurrent grow and understood that real influence rarely announced itself. It accumulated, patiently, in the spaces no one thought to measure. Still, opposition hardened elsewhere. A prominent panelist from the event gave an interview suggesting that Keanu's approach was emotionally evasive, accusing him of hiding behind kindness to avoid confronting systemic issues more aggressively. The accusation stung not because it was cruel, but because it misunderstood him so completely. Keanu did not respond publicly, and that silence unsettled critics even more. In a culture conditioned to equate volume with conviction, refusal to perform outrage felt threatening. Alexandra felt anger rise for the first time, not explosive but sharp, and had to remind herself that the urge to correct every misrepresentation itself was a trap, one that could pull them away from the values that mattered. The turning point came unexpectedly during a small, unrecorded gathering organized by community leaders who had been quietly watching the discourse unfold. They invited Keanu not as a celebrity speaker, but as a listener, asking him to sit with people whose lives were shaped daily by the very assumptions being debated online. There were no cameras, no moderators, no applause cues, only raw stories shared without polish or protection. Keanu spoke even less than usual that night, and when he did, it was only to ask questions, to clarify, to understand. Alexandra observed how the room transformed not through rhetoric, but through presence, how people leaned forward not because they were being impressed, but because they were being respected. When one attendee finally asked why he never defended himself publicly, Keanu answered simply, without drama, that defending an image mattered less than protecting a principle, and that if his silence allowed others to speak more honestly, then it had done its work. The answer did not resolve everything, it wasn't meant to, but it grounded the conversation in something real, something human, and for those present, it reframed the entire controversy. They left not with talking points, but with questions, about how often they mistook loud certainty for truth, and how rarely they allowed quiet integrity to challenge their assumptions. By the time Keanu and Alexandra returned home that night, the world outside still buzzed with debate, but inside there was clarity. Both of them understood that the story unfolding was larger than a single event or reaction, and that its resolution would not arrive neatly or quickly. Justice, when it came, would not be theatrical. It would be slow, uneven, and deeply personal, unfolding in changed behaviors rather than viral moments. And as Alexandra watched Keanu sit in thoughtful silence, unburdened by the need to explain himself, she realized that the greatest act of resistance he offered the world was not what he said, but what he refused to become. The reckoning did not arrive with shouting or scandal. It came dressed as opportunity, wrapped in polite language and professional urgency, which made it far more dangerous than open hostility ever could have been. Keanu was invited to participate in a televised roundtable discussion, framed as a balanced conversation about influence, responsibility, and modern activism, a setting designed not for understanding but for spectacle, where nuance was often sacrificed for conflict that could be neatly packaged and replayed. Alexandra sensed the trap immediately, not because she doubted Keanu's ability to speak, but because she understood how environments like these rewarded certainty over sincerity and interruption over listening. Declining the invitation would be interpreted as avoidance, while accepting it would expose him to voices eager to provoke rather than engage. Yet Keanu chose to go, not out of obligation to his image, but out of respect for the people watching, who might still be searching for something honest amid the noise. The studio lights were unforgiving, flattening everything into contrast and shadow, and the audience energy felt sharp, expectant, as though people had arrived not to learn, but to witness a verdict. The panelists represented a spectrum of opinions, some thoughtful, others rigid, and at least one who had already publicly criticized Keanu's silence as moral cowardice. From the moment the cameras rolled, the conversation moved quickly, too quickly, questions overlapping, answers interrupted, complexity trimmed down to fit the pace of entertainment. Keanu listened more than he spoke, absorbing the cadence of accusation and defense that defined the space, and Alexandra watched from off-camera, recognizing how easily such settings could distort intention and turn restraint into liability. The confrontation came when one panelist, emboldened by applause and momentum, directly challenged Keanu, asking why he continued to hide behind gentleness instead of using his platform more aggressively, suggesting that quiet reflection was a luxury unavailable to those facing daily injustice. The words were framed as concerned, but carried the unmistakable edge of judgment, and the room leaned forward, anticipating a defensive response, a breaking point, something that could finally confirm the narrative they had been building. Keanu did not rush to answer. He took a breath, long enough for discomfort to ripple through the studio, long enough to remind everyone that silence could still command attention. When he spoke, his voice was steady, unraised, and deliberate, and the effect was immediate. He acknowledged the pain behind the criticism without conceding to its premise, explaining that urgency did not require aggression, and that empathy lost its power the moment it became performative. He spoke about the difference between speaking for others and standing with them, about how the loudest voices often drowned out the very people they claimed to represent. There was no accusation in his tone, only clarity, and that clarity unsettled the room far more than anger ever could. The applause that followed was scattered and uncertain, not because the words lacked weight, but because they resisted easy alignment. The discussion grew tense as the panelists struggled to respond to an argument that refused to simplify itself. Attempts to provoke Keanu into choosing a side failed repeatedly, each time met with an insistence on humanity over ideology, listening over labeling. Alexandra could see the shift happening in real time, the way the audience's energy changed from anticipation of conflict to something closer to introspection, though not everyone welcomed it. Some viewers wanted a winner, a decisive blow, and his refusal to provide one frustrated them, revealing how deeply the culture had become addicted to confrontation as proof of conviction. After the broadcast ended, reactions poured in faster than before, sharper and more divided. Some accused Keanu of moral neutrality, others praised his restraint as rare courage, and many found themselves unsettled without fully understanding why. The discomfort spread beyond comment sections and into conversations at workplaces, schools, and homes, where people debated not just what he had said, but why it bothered them so deeply.
Alexandra noticed messages arriving quietly, privately, from individuals who admitted they had once dismissed gentleness as weakness and were now reconsidering how often they equated volume with value. These confessions did not go viral, but they mattered more than any trending clip. The cost of this clarity became personal when an organization Keanu had long supported reconsidered his involvement, citing concerns that his approach no longer aligned with their public-facing strategy. The decision was delivered respectfully, almost apologetically, yet it carried the unmistakable implication that integrity was only welcome when it remained convenient. Keanu accepted the decision without bitterness, understanding that alignment built on optics rather than values was always temporary. Alexandra felt the sting more sharply than he did, not because she doubted his choice, but because she saw how often systems punished those who refused to perform certainty on command. That evening, in the quiet of their home, the weight of the past weeks finally settled, not as regret, but as exhaustion. Alexandra asked the question she had been holding back, not accusing, not pleading, but honest, whether the cost was becoming too high. Keanu considered it carefully before answering, admitting that the cost was real, but so was the alternative, and that becoming louder at the expense of truth would hollow everything he believed in. He spoke about the responsibility of being seen, about how visibility without authenticity only deepened the very injustices people claimed to fight, and as he spoke, Alexandra understood that this was not stubbornness, but conviction shaped by years of watching how easily good intentions could become weapons when stripped of humility. The story, however, refused to remain confined to studios and statements. In places far removed from cameras, people began to act differently, inspired not by a call to action, but by permission to slow down, to listen, to lead without dominating. Small initiatives formed quietly, conversations shifted tone, and some who had once mocked restraint found themselves practicing it, discovering that strength did not diminish when shared gently. These changes were uneven, incomplete, and fragile, yet they carried the unmistakable mark of something genuine taking root. By the end of that week, it was clear that the debate was no longer about Keanu at all. It had become a mirror, reflecting back a society uncomfortable with patience, uneasy with humility, and deeply conflicted about what real leadership looked like. Alexandra watched as the narrative continued to evolve beyond their control, and instead of fear, she felt resolve. Whatever came next would test them further, but it would also reveal, for once and for all, whether the world was ready to hear the quiet truths it so often claimed to seek. And in that uncertainty, the final turning point waited, not with spectacle, but with consequence. The shift, when it finally arrived, did not announce itself with breaking news banners or urgent alerts. It came the way truth often does, through accumulation rather than explosion, through the slow realization that something essential had been misunderstood for far too long. In the weeks following the televised debate, the cultural temperature began to change in subtle but undeniable ways, not because people suddenly agreed, but because they could no longer ignore the questions that had been planted. Discussions about leadership, activism, and influence grew more reflective, less performative, and while disagreement remained, the tone softened, as if many had begun to recognize that constant outrage had exhausted its own usefulness. At the center of this unspoken recalibration stood Keanu Reeves, not as a symbol or spokesperson, but as a living contradiction to the assumption that impact required dominance. The moment that crystallized everything occurred during a large international summit focused on ethical leadership and community responsibility, an event Keanu attended not as a keynote speaker, but as an observer invited by organizers who valued perspective over publicity. What none of them anticipated was that the final session, meant to conclude with polished remarks and ceremonial optimism, would unravel into something far more honest when an unexpected voice took the microphone. A young organizer, visibly nervous but resolute, addressed the room and spoke about how the past months had changed her understanding of power, admitting that she had once believed loud certainty was the only way to be taken seriously, until she watched someone refuse that script and remain unwavering nonetheless. She described how Keanu's refusal to perform outrage had given her permission to lead without abandoning her values, and as she spoke, others followed, one after another, sharing stories not of admiration for a celebrity, but of personal transformation sparked by witnessing restraint modeled without apology. Keanu remained seated throughout, his expression unchanged, almost uncomfortable with the attention, and that discomfort only reinforced the authenticity of the moment. When he was finally invited to respond, he did so reluctantly, standing not to claim the spotlight, but to redirect it, emphasizing that the credit belonged to those willing to listen, to change, and to act with care, even when care was misread. He spoke about responsibility not as a burden, but as a relationship, something nurtured through patience rather than enforced through pressure, and the room listened in a way that felt different from before, quieter not from obligation, but from respect. The applause that followed was not loud, but it was sustained, and it carried the unmistakable weight of understanding finally earned. Outside the summit walls, consequences unfolded just as steadily. Organizations that had distanced themselves earlier began reaching out again, not to reclaim association, but to acknowledge misjudgment. Some offered public apologies, others quiet conversations, admitting that they had confused marketable passion with genuine commitment. Keanu accepted these gestures without triumph, engaging only where values aligned, declining where optics still outweighed integrity. Alexandra Grant watched these developments with a grounded sense of affirmation, not because vindication had arrived, but because the cost they had endured was finally revealing its purpose. She saw how often systems resisted change until they were forced to confront their own contradictions, and how rarely they did so without an example that refused to bend. The most profound resolution, however, occurred far from stages and statements, in the quiet recognition of people who had once dismissed gentleness as weakness and now saw it as discipline. Teachers adjusted how they addressed conflict in classrooms, leaders reconsidered how they framed authority, and individuals began questioning their instinct to speak over listening. None of these changes could be traced to a single quote or clip, yet all of them bore the imprint of a presence that had refused to compete in a culture addicted to winning. Keanu never claimed these outcomes, never positioned himself as a catalyst or cause, and that refusal only strengthened the lesson at the heart of the story, that real influence often operated best when it was least interested in recognition. On an evening that felt ordinary in every way, Keanu and Alexandra walked together through a neighborhood park, the city hum distant and softened by distance, reflecting on how strange it was that something so quiet had traveled so far. Alexandra spoke about the fear people felt when familiar narratives dissolved, about how anger often rushed in to fill the space left behind by uncertainty, and Keanu listened, acknowledging that discomfort was inevitable when growth demanded humility. They both understood that the story would never truly end, that there would always be those who preferred noise to nuance, certainty to curiosity, but they also knew that a different path had been made visible, one that others could choose if they wished. The justice in this story did not arrive as punishment or humiliation, it arrived as exposure, revealing how shallow many judgments had been and how unnecessary the cruelty that often accompanied them. Those who had underestimated quiet strength were not shamed publicly, but they were confronted internally, forced to reconcile their assumptions with a reality that no longer supported them. This form of justice lingered, harder to dismiss and impossible to erase, reshaping perspectives long after headlines faded. It was not the kind of ending that satisfied a hunger for spectacle, but it was the kind that endured, the kind that changed behavior rather than opinions. In the end, the truth settled gently, the way it always had, not demanding agreement, only honesty.
Keanu had spoken softly, yes, but the echo of that softness carried farther than any shout, reaching people ready to hear something different, something deeper. The world did not become kinder overnight, nor did misunderstanding vanish, but a line had been drawn, not in anger, but in principle, reminding anyone willing to listen that strength did not need to be loud to be real, and that respect, once modeled, had a way of teaching itself. And in that quiet, lasting understanding, the story found its true conclusion, not as a moment remembered, but as a standard raised.